Today I'm going to be showing you my favorite method of sewing contrasting binding on my handmade swimsuits, like this one. Hi there, welcome to my channel. My name is Carmen and I am basically just someone who loves to sew her own clothes and loves to show you how to do it too. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you one of my favorite techniques when it comes to sewing swimwear, and that is sewing a contrasting binding around all the edges of your handmade swimsuits. So you can do this method either with or without elastic, but I'm going to show you how to do it with elastic because I always recommend using elastic in your swimwear because they will last a lot longer and will hold up better to wear and tear, and they'll also stay on better when they get wet because sometimes swimsuits can tend to get droopy if they get wet and you don't have elastic to hold everything in place. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so the first thing you'll need to do is prepare your pattern for adding your binding. So the binding is going to make it so that we don't fold under any seam allowance, so we need to cut off the seam allowance along all of the edges that you plan on binding. So for this basic top, I would cut off the seam allowance along the bottom because I'm going to bind the bottom edge, also along the necklines on the front and back, as well as the armhole openings. So the places that you would not remove your seam allowance would be the shoulder seams, as well as the side seams, because you're still going to need those seam allowances to attach the fronts and the backs together. So for what I've done here, I've already removed seam allowances from this and I've already cut out my swimsuit, but this is just to let you know that before you make a swimsuit that you're going to include a binding on, you want to make sure that you remove your seam allowances from the areas that you plan to bind. And if you forget, you can always cut the seam allowances off of the actual swimsuit after you cut it out as well. Next, you can cut your swimsuit out. So I have cut out both my outer fabric and my lining, and I've sewn the lining and the outer fabric together separately. And we're going to attach these together with the binding. So you want to get your swimsuit to the point where you have the lining put together, the outer fabric put together, and then we can pin the lining into the outer fabric. So I'm going to turn my lining swimsuit inside out so that my seam allowances are showing. And then I'm going to put it inside of the outer fabric swimsuit, and we're gonna match it with wrong sides touching. So the wrong side of the lining is going to be together with the wrong side of my outer swimsuit fabric. So I've got that, and next I'm going to pin around all of these openings. So the waistline, the neck hole, as well as both armholes. And I'm just going to make sure while I do that, that I am matching up the seams, because we want to make sure that the shoulder seams and the side seams match up between the lining and the outer fabric. So I always start by pinning all the seams together first, and then I fill in with pins around the rest of the openings. Okay, so I've got my lining and outer fabric pinned together around all of the openings, and now we can set this aside for a minute and we're going to cut our binding. So I'm going to be using this leopard print or cheetah print, I don't really know which it is, but this animal print fabric as my binding. So I'm going to be cutting strips of this for my binding, but first we need to figure out what length of binding we need. So to do that, we're going to grab our pattern back again. So to calculate the length for our binding, we're going to do some math and some measuring of our pattern. So to find the length of the binding for the neckline, you would walk your tape measure along the neckline opening for the front, which gives us 7.5 inches. Then walk your tape measure along the neckline for the back, which gives us 5.5 inches. So then we would multiply each of those numbers by 2. So 7.5 for the front neckline times 2 gives us 15. 5.5 times 2 for the front or for the back neckline here gives us 11. So then we're going to add those two measurements together to get the total length from the pattern. So 11 plus 15 gives us 26 inches, but we still need to take our seam allowance out of that because we are going to sew the back to the front before we put the binding on. So to find the total length when it's sewn together, we need to subtract 1 inch for our seam allowance, because we are taking 1/4 inch each from the front and the back for each shoulder seam. So that's going to be a total of 4 1/4 inch seam allowances, which adds up to 1 inch total. So take 1 inch from 26 gives us 25 inches. So 25 inches is the length around the entire neckline once it's sewn together. So for the binding, I like to cut my binding 20% smaller than the length around the entire neckline, or around whatever opening you're binding, because you want your binding to be slightly shorter than the opening you're trying to bind so that it holds everything in nice and tight with the elastic. You don't want it to be the same length, and you definitely don't want it to be longer than the opening you are trying to bind. So to find 20% of our 25-inch neckline opening, you would multiply 25 by 0.2, which tells us that 5 inches needs to be subtracted from our original 25 to make our binding 20% smaller than the neckline. So 25 minus 5 is 20, so we're going to cut our binding 20 inches long, and I'm going to add in 1/2 inch to my binding length for seam allowance. So the binding will be cut 20.5 inches long. So once it's sewn together, it'll be 20 inches long, which is 20% shorter than the opening that we're binding. So then you would just repeat that process for the waist opening, or the bottom edge here. So find the length on the front, the length on the back, multiply those by 2, subtract 1 inch for your seam allowance, multiply by 0.2 to find 20% of that, and then subtract that number from your total, and you will find the length of your binding. Then add 1/2 inch to your binding length for seam allowance. For the armhole openings, it would be very similar. You would just measure the front armhole, the back armhole, but then instead of multiplying those by 2, because there's 2 separate armholes, rather than it being cut on the fold like the front bottom edge, like the bottom edges as well as the neckline openings, the armholes, you will measure each of those. Don't multiply by 2, just add them together, then subtract your 1 inch seam allowance, multiply by 0.2, subtract that number from your total, Then add in 1/2 inch for your binding seam allowance, and that'll be the length you cut your binding for the armhole openings. And just make sure for the armholes that you cut 2 of that exact same length, because you're gonna have 2 armholes to bind. And so then we have the lengths for all of our bindings, and I will put those calculations up on the screen now so that you can screenshot it or pause the video there so you don't have to remember everything that I just said about how to calculate those. So hopefully that helps you out. So once we have the lengths for all our bindings, then we're going to cut them at that length. And I like to cut them in strips of 1.5 inches wide because that gives me enough room to work with for the binding. So now I'm just going to cut 4 binding strips out of this leopard, cheetah print, whatever it is, fabric. And I'm going to cut them by I'm going to cut 1 the length for the neckline opening, 1 the length for the waistline opening, and 2 the length we calculate for the armhole opening, and I'm going to cut them all 1.5 inches wide. Alrighty, so I've got my bindings cut here. So I'm just going to show you how to attach the binding on one of the openings. So we're gonna start here with let's do the neckline. So the first thing that we need to do to prepare our binding is to fold it with the right sides together, and we're going to pin it along this short edge. So we're matching up the 2 short edges of the rectangle. Alright, so I've got the short ends pinned together, right sides together, and now I'm going to take this to my serger and I'm just going to serge these edges together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You could also use a zigzag stitch with your sewing machine, whatever stitch you normally use to sew your swimwear. Alrighty, so I've got that serged together. So here's what we have now. We have a loop. So I'm going to take this now to my iron and I'm just gonna really quick press the seam allowance to one side. I just like to press even my swimwear. I just like everything to be nice and crisp. Alrighty, so I've got my seam allowance pressed to one side. Everything's looking good. So next we need to use pins to split this loop into 4 equal sized sections. And this is because when we pin it to our top, we want to make sure that we pin it so that it's equally spaced around the neckline opening. We want the stretch to be equally distributed around the neckline. So I'm going to put a pin first here at the seam. Then I'm going to fold it at that first pin that I just put in and find the spot that's exactly opposite that pin. So that's going to split it in half. So I'm going to put a pin here where it folds at the other side. All right, got that pin. So now I'm going to pull it like this so that my pins are at the center, and I'm going to match up my 2 pins here at the center. All right, so my pins are matching up right there. So then I'm going to put another pin on each side where it folds. So that's going to split this loop into 4 equally sized sections once I get these 2 pins in. There we go. So I've got my 4 equally spaced pins in my binding. Next, we can grab our swim top here. And now I'm going to also put pins in to equally space the neckline opening so that we can match up the neckline opening pins with the pins in the binding. So what I like to do is pick a color of pin and use that color for my 4 equally spaced pins. So it looks like I don't have any yellow pins in the neckline currently, so we're gonna go with yellow. So the first thing I'm going to do is put in a yellow pin here at the center front. So I'm just gonna trade it out for this red pin. So that looks like approximately the center of the center front. So then I'm gonna fold it along that pin. And then I'm just going to walk my neckline edges together to find the spot on the back of the neckline that is exactly opposite where I put that first pin. So that's going to be right there. So I'm going to put a yellow pin there, trade it out for this blue pin. So next, we're going to match up the front yellow pin with the back yellow pin. And then we're just going to walk each of the sides of the neckline along to find the spot on each side that's going to split each side in half equally. So we're doing the exact same thing we did with that loop, except with the neckline. So there's one. So now I'm going to walk the other side along. So here we go. So I have 4 evenly spaced yellow pins around the neckline opening. So now what we need to do is pin the binding to the neckline opening. And I have tried in the past sewing the neckline first and then taking all of these pins out and then attaching the binding with a second set of stitching. But I've found that I have a lot of trouble with my first line of stitching showing through on the right side after I attach my binding with a second round of stitching. So because I don't get them exactly evenly lined up, it's very difficult to do that. So I find that it works a lot better to sew through all 3 layers in one pass. So the lining, the outer fabric, and the binding all at one time, and then we'll go back over it with the elastic with a second set of stitching. So that'll keep you from having any issues with your stitching showing through on the right side. All right, so first what we need to do here is turn our binding inside out, leaving the swimsuit right sides out. So I'm gonna line up the pin at the seam here with the pin at the center back of the neckline. So I'm matching those 2 pins right sides together, and then I'm just going to switch out one of the pins to pin them together where those pins match up. So then I'm going to pin through all 3 layers where those 2 pins matched up and then take out the remaining pin. So I've got 1. So next I'm going to walk this along to the next yellow pin. I'm going to match up my second pin on the binding with my yellow pin on that side on the neckline. Match them up, pin them where they match up, take out the remaining pin. Then do the same thing at the center front of the neckline. Match up my 2 pins, pin them where they match up, then take out my remaining pin. And then I'm also going to do that to match up my final yellow pin with the final pin on my binding. So matching up my pins, pinning through all 3 layers, and then taking out that remaining pin. So now our binding is evenly spaced around the neckline. So when we sew it, we're going to stretch it evenly between each of those sets of pins. But what I'm going to do first is I am going to actually stretch between one of my sets of pins, find where it matches up with the pins already in my neckline, and then I'm just going to switch out the pins in the neckline and switch them out to pin through all 3 layers. So I have my binding pinned to my neckline, so now what I'm going to do is take this to my serger and I'm just going to serge the binding onto the neckline, and I'm just going to stretch the fabric as I sew, just stretching it enough that the fabric is laying flat. So we're not going to end up really stretching the binding much. We're just going to be mostly stretching the neckline of the swim top to match the length of the binding. Alrighty, so I got my binding sewn onto the neckline. So we need to cut a piece of elastic that's the same length as the binding. Alright, so I got my piece of elastic. So what I'm going to do now is overlap the ends of my elastic by about 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm just going to stitch the ends of the elastic together on my sewing machine to sew this into a loop. Alrighty, so here I've got my elastic sewn into a loop. So next we need to quarter our elastic the same way that we quartered the binding before. So I'm just going to put in my 4 evenly spaced pins. Alright, so I've got my 4 evenly spaced pins in my elastic loop. So now, once again, I need to split the neckline with 4 evenly spaced pins. Alright, I'm going to turn this back so the binding is on the outside. So I've got it split evenly, and the elastic, we want to sew it onto the binding side here. So I'm going to match up the 4 pins on my elastic with the 4 pins around the neckline, and I'm going to just match up those pins, pin them where the pins match up, and then take out the remaining pin or the extra pin. So I have my 4 evenly spaced pins, I have my elastic pinned to the neckline opening. So now I'm going to take this to my serger, and I am just going to serge the elastic onto the already serged edge of the neckline, and I'm just going to stretch it just enough that the elastic fits into the opening between each pin. Alright, so our elastic is sewn to the neckline along the binding side. So it's looking a little wonky right now, but it should straighten out after the next step. Also, once I get the armhole binding, that'll help it straighten out because it gets pulled. These are such thin straps, it kind of gets pulled in towards the binding side when I have the elastic sewn to the neckline, but not the armholes. So once the armholes are also bound, then this will straighten out quite a bit. But, so now we need to take this to the actual sewing machine, and you can use a zigzag stitch, a stretch stitch, or a double needle, whatever you prefer for your top stitching, or you could use a cover stitch machine. But I'm going to use my regular sewing machine, and I'm going to use a zigzag stitch, and what we're going to do is just fold the binding up and over the elastic like so that the raw edge is going down towards the wrong side of the swimsuit. And then we're just going to top stitch right through that elastic all the way around the neckline. So I don't like to use pins for this. I just flip it up and over as I sew at the machine. Pins just complicate things for this step. Just making sure that it's taut along the edge of the elastic the entire time I'm sewing. You want to make sure it's not like loose and hanging out too far, so just making sure it's tucked nice and tight under the elastic, and then top stitching all the way around the neckline. so my binding is top stitched on, and I think I forgot to mention earlier that I like to sew not right exactly through the center of my binding. I prefer to sew more towards the inner edge of the binding, because then when we trim away this excess on the back, we're going to show less of the stitching underneath, and it'll just look a little bit cleaner if you sew a little bit closer to the inner edge of the binding. So next, what I'm going to do is use a hand sewing needle and pull these thread tails onto the inside and then tie my thread tails off. That's just me. I like extra security on my top stitching for all my swimwear, because I find that just back stitching tends to come out at some point in the future. I just find that it lasts longer, the stitching lasts longer if I tie my thread tails off. So next, what I need to do is come in with my scissors and just trim away this excess fabric on the binding. All right, got that trimmed off. So you can see how much nicer that looks on the inside now with that excess fabric trimmed away. So this is from the inside. Here we go. So that's the inside and the outside. So isn't that just so cute? It definitely adds quite a bit of extra work, but I think it's so worth it because I just love the look of the binding. All right, so that is all there is to it. So then you just repeat that process with the other pieces of binding we've cut along the other openings. And then, ta-da! It's done! So I hope that you enjoyed this video and have some fun sewing some fun contrasting swim bindings. And if you are new here, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.